I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Editing Podcast. So this week, Denise are delighted to be joined by our pal Andy Hodges again.
Hello.
Yeah, we are. Hello, Andy. Yeah. So if you didn't catch Andy in the episode on world building, which is episode 115, he's the owner of The Narrative Craft, which is an editorial business offering developmental editing, line editing, and coaching to fiction authors and creative scholars.
That's right. And another one of Andy's specialisms is editing translated materials, which requires a special level of artistry, I think, and sensitivity. So that's what we asked him to come back and chat about. So, Andy.
Yep.
Welcome.
Hello again.
Hello.
So, Andy, can you start by telling us what kinds of translated materials that you edit?
So I edit novels and short stories, and occasionally I'll do a cultural anthropology text. So that would be like humanities and social sciences. And I used to do a lot more of that a few years ago because I started out as an academic editor and then I pivoted to fiction.
Yeah, that's because you were talking in the world building thing about your academic history, and we found that really interesting from the world building perspective. But of course, you know, it makes sense from this as well.
Absolutely.
So, Andy, what would you say is the difference between editing a translation and editing a text written in English by a multilingual author?
Oh, that's a complex question. So
Sorry.
I would say that, first of all, if you're editing a translation, that usually means this is a formal translation and you have a source text somewhere written in another language. If you're editing a text written in English by a multilingual author, that could be kind of from scratch. So there probably isn't a source text in another language, but that kind of text would still be perhaps an informal translation, depending on the language background. So there are lots of similarities there. Yeah.
So do you mean then that somebody who is writing in English, which isn't their first language, when you say that's an informal translation, do you mean that they're sort of translating it in their head as they go along, or that they've maybe written it in their own language and then translated it themselves?
So that really depends on their language background and how their engagement with English. So if they're living in an English-speaking country, and I can speak from experience because I've been on the other side of that, living in Croatia and learning Croatian, there comes a point when you start to think in another language, and the idioms and all the different phrasings and things start to feel really natural. So, but that's a point that some authors reach and some don't. So it really depends on their background, really.
Yeah. Do you think it's important to know that? Sorry, Louise. Do you think it's important to know their language background before you start working on it, or does it not really make a difference to how you approach the text?
I think it is important to know the language background because the kinds of mistakes they will make can depend on that background. So I'll give you a quick example here, but in French and in Croatian, the word syndicat means trade union, and they might do a literal translation of that and write in English, the syndicates. And that could be confusing if you didn't know. They're coming from French or Croatian.
Yeah.
So it's like those false friends, really, aren't they? In language translation. Yeah.
That's all about false friends.
Yeah.
Andy, how long did you live in Croatia for?
10 years altogether, from 2008 to 2018.
Oh, okay.
Wow. So what level of proficiency did you get to in Croatian, if you don't mind my asking?
I did all of those European exams and I got to the top level, which is C2.
C2? Right.
And I took my translation exams over there as well. So, yeah, I really...
You're very proficient. Yeah, you're very proficient. If you're C2 level, that's really impressive.
That must have really, I mean, it's interesting because you said just before, I've been on the other side of the fence. And so having experienced that, what it is to learn in another language and actively go as far as testing your proficiency and being sort of assessed on it over a decade. that must be really useful when you're in doing an edit for somebody where that kind of understanding and kind of empathy.
Exactly. Yeah, no, there's a lot of empathy there because I know what it feels like to be in that position.
Yeah.
So, and that's incredibly helpful when collaborating and building relationships with authors. And I also know what it feels like for somebody to take a text I've written in Croatian and make it look much better. So
I've worked with. Sorry,
no,
go ahead,
no,
Denise.
go on.
I was just going to say I've worked with an author in the past year whose English is excellent, but there were just thinking about some of those things you were talking about, Andy, in terms of understanding the sort of little snafus that you come to recognise. And what I noticed that this author tended to struggle with prepositions. The sort of natural sounding prepositions that we might choose about, the difference between walking on a street or along as opposed to along a street, and just those things that as someone who was born speaking English and who, well, English is really only my first language in terms of proficiency. It's something that I can't even necessarily articulate the reasons behind it. I just know that that's kind of the natural. I know what sounds natural, and those are the things that this author struggled with. So even though I would say that their English is excellent, I mean, it's just excellent. Their written and spoken English is excellent, and yet there are these little things which sort of give the game away in a sense that it's not their first language.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And for me, I find that editing translated materials and editing for multilingual authors, it's on a spectrum, and at one end you've got a complete rewrite where you're reconstructing a style and a voice, and then most of the time it's what I'd call line editing or stylistic editing, where you're refining the style and the voice. And then it's at the other end of the spectrum you've got light copy editing, but I find with that light copy editing, it's just the kind of mistakes that those authors make are subtly different to the ones that speakers with a first an L1 English background, so if English is their first language, would make.
You've preempted my question there, Andy, because I was going to ask you whether you would call it stylistic line editing or technical copy editing. So you're saying it's really a spectrum, just depending on what the text needs and the sort of errors that you're coming up against, because that was a very interesting conversation that took place in one of our editing forums recently, wasn't it? Do you want to expand a little bit on that, about this sort of stylistic side of, I'm thinking particularly of your translated materials, what sort of things you would focus on when you're doing that?
Yeah, so I'll reiterate, I think the level of intervention really depends, and then it's what you call it. So when I first started, that would be nearly 10 years ago, I didn't have any formal copy editing training at that point, but I was hired by authors in Croatia who were other academics, and they just were saying to me, I want this text to look like a L1 English speaker, a proficient English speaker has written it. In those situations, the kind of changes that I'm making are stylistic. So I'm making the style look more like an English academic style. And just for comparison, so academic style in Croatian is very formal compared to English. English uses a lot more verbs, a lot less nominalizations and very formal constructions. So I'll be making those kind of changes. And that would help them when they're submitting their journal article to an Anglo-American journal. But it wouldn't be professional copy editing at that point. I wouldn't have changed, for example, I didn't have Perfect It. I wouldn't have corrected the ISE and IZE and all of that kind of thing. So
M dashes and N dashes and stuff
that.
Yeah,
all of that. So it definitely would have needed another round of copy editing after that. And it was only when I went full-time professional that I really got all of that training, and I think I was able to offer that sort of stylistic help and traditional copy editing too. And I also think I now do that stylistic stuff much better because I've been trained in precisely what level of intervention is appropriate.
Right.
Like in the early days, I think I was probably imposing my ideas about certain words and style too much, which I think is really common among beginner editors.
Yeah, I think we get carried away with our own ability really sometimes in the early stages. It's learning to rein that in a little bit, isn't it?
Exactly.
And it is that thing. I think I mean, we've had conversations about this before, not in relation to this specific topic of this episode, but just more generally, that idea that when people say, oh, but I only work with independent authors on fiction, therefore I don't need any formal proofreading or copy editing foundational training. And actually, sometimes learning that baseline stuff, even if you end up deciding, at least you can make a decision. No, I'm not going to apply that here because, but at least you know what it is that you've decided not to apply, or that you've decided to bend, or you know, just shift away from ever so slightly. You know, you can make much more informed decisions, and then communicate those decisions as well, not just your clients, but to other editors if you're you know, if there are other editors involved in a project. So it's interesting that how you found that doing technical foundation training actually made you a better stylistic and creative editor as well.
And it gives you more confidence as well. Knowing that.
Sorry, carry on. I keep in.
Knowing that you've been through that process, you know the rules, so you can choose to break them with it's that intentionality.
Absolutely. So Andy, when you do an edit of a translated text, do you combine your stylistic and your copy editing? Or does that depend, or would you keep them entirely separate on some occasions? Is that what it depends?
It depends on the level of intervention needed, but for most jobs I will do what I call a main edit, so that would be the main pass, and then I'll do a final read through as well, where I'm really just catching any remaining typos and things like that.
So like a quality control check,
kind of. So, and I will say to them, I mean, often there will be another editor who will look at it later on in the process anyway. So, but I just think if you're making lots of interventions, then it can be handy just to have that final read through.
Do you know, I so agree with that, because I think especially when you're doing quite heavy stylistic editing, it's so easy, I know from my own experience, to introduce errors and typographical errors. And what I often do is I don't do necessarily a second pass as such, but I'll do it on a chapter by chapter basis. So I'll line edit a chapter, and then I'll go back and just read through it just to see where I've I think, because the reason I do it like that is just because for me, by the time I get to the end of a project, I've kind of got closure in mind. And I think if I had to go back to the beginning and do a full read
the whole thing again,
for me that would be it just doesn't kind of, I haven't got the mindset for that. So it's just I'm doing what you're doing, Andy. I'm just doing it in a different way.
And I think it's a bit different. So with a journal article, it wouldn't be a mammoth task.
No, exactly.
But if you've got a novel in front of you, then I know myself, it can take 1 day, 1.5 days to do that final read.
Or a short story. So, again, that's something that you could, or you know, that I would definitely, I would follow your line on that. So Andy, I mean, how did you get into this? Do you translate as well, or do you just edit translated materials?
Okay, so when I started around 10 years ago, I just started receiving requests from my academic network, and some of them were for translation, some of them were for editing. So I gave translation a go. I trained in literary translation too, but I just prefer editing, because with translation you can roughly do about 2,000 words a day, and that's comfortably and well. Some people will do more than that.
Whereas not a lot, is it?
It's not a lot, no. Whereas with a heavy style edit, I usually do between 6,000 and 8,000 words. So just covering a lot more ground, basically. And that feels good, because it feels like you've got a bit more of a, not a bird's eye perspective, but a more of a distance perspective, and I just enjoy it more.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. I think it's often the case with different types of editing, isn't it, or language support. It very much depends on the person's mindset, and for some people that kind of really, really kind of slow, measured, 2,000 words a day kind of thing, that might suit someone really well, but and it might suit someone, for example, who only has 2,000 who likes working over a single project over an extended period of time, and but for others it's just how you're wired.
No, exactly.
It's like do you like the quickish turnover of things, or do you like to be immersed and stuff? That's like when I it's completely different, but when I was a physio, I liked the quick turnover of working in A&E and working in fracture clinic, where I knew things were going to get better relatively quickly, rather than working in rehab where you might be working with a patient for months, who's maybe had a stroke or a brain injury or something. And I wasn't my good fit. So I can see how the same thing works with language work as well, that, some people are just better designed to do certain types of sort of subsections of work within that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, if you're translating, you might only need 3 or 4 books a year, maybe even less than that. And then you might not have to do much marketing at all, which suits some people.
Exactly. That's a good point. That's a really good point.
So it's really horses for courses.
Just as well that we don't all like the same thing, really, isn't
Absolutely.
it? So Andy, you've mentioned that your language skills are with Croatian, and I think you know a couple of other of those sort of Balkan languages as well, don't you? A little bit. But
yeah,
a little bit. But what I wanted to know is, do you need to be familiar with the writer's first language to work well on translated materials, or so are you equally happy working on something that has been translated from a completely different language to Croatian, for example?
Okay, no, that's a really good question, and I think the answer is actually quite subtle. So if you're doing non-fiction, many kinds of non-fiction, and I know Catherine O'Moore-Klopf has talked about this, she's argued that you don't need to know the first language, you can simply raise more author queries. And I agree with that. I think that's absolutely fine for non-fiction. It might be a little bit easier for you, for sure, if you know that that source language, that other language, and you might be more tuned into the kind of mistakes that could be made, but I wouldn't say it's necessary. Now, with fiction, what I think is important is if you're translating from a different literary tradition, then I think it's important to be familiar with that tradition and to know how much the author wants it adapted or not to Anglo-American publishing norms. So
that makes
Can you give us an example of that, Andy?
So one of the examples that's often talked about is that there's a I'm not sure what it's called, but there's a style of there's a genre or a style of writing in Japan that de-emphasizes conflict, whereas in Western literary traditions, conflict is often heavily emphasized or even seen as fundamental. Every story needs conflict. I think it's called Kishōtenketsu, but I'm not sure how to pronounce that. We can put a link in the chat. So that's one example where if you're editing that story from an Anglo-American perspective, you might be like, where's the action? What's happening? You might want to make lots of interventions and give lots of suggestions that aren't particularly culturally sensitive.
And that's almost like a developmental editing level then, isn't it? Rather, it's sort of bigger than line level style work. It's sort of the very bones of the novel.
And I suppose then would it depend on whether the focus of the translation was in preserving that or adapting it to an Anglo-American audience? Because that would be that's a rewrite then, isn't it?
Yeah, so translation is often described as a paraphrasing or a rewriting in another language. So, but then it's how far you go with that and how close you stick to the source text. And what's interesting is that authority is often important here as well. So a new author, a young new author looking for a publishing deal in the Anglo-American world is likely to be much more open to having the style, for instance, adapted to meet those norms than somebody who has published, somebody very senior who's published lots of novels, who they might be a lot less open to having their style changed and things like that.
Yeah, because I mean, that's for many authors, the kind of style they choose to write in, the literary style they choose is, it's sort of soul deep, isn't it? Sometimes, you know, not always, but it can be sort of. I can imagine some people thinking, "Oh no, no, hands off, hands off my style."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Andy, when you're editing translated materials, are there particular general issues that you tend to find might come up? Just thinking about people who are thinking of expanding into this kind of work, particularly if they've got another language that they're proficient in, and as referencing there your discussion about the source language. What kind of things do you think people should think about?
Okay, so we've already touched on false friends. Besides that, among advanced people with a lot of translation experience, terminology is often something that is wrongly, or they make the wrong choices when they're translating a text, or it's not done in a very consistent way. Now, that's not often quite so important for fiction as for, say, medical editing.
Good grief,
yeah.
But there are lots of other kinds of errors to look out for when editing translated materials. So register errors, that often comes up, where, for example, in a very formal academic text, I might see a phrase like, and then they did a runner, or something like that.
Colloquialisms that we just don't normally expect to see in formal writing.
Exactly, and that's a process, because I know when I went to live in Croatia, I would be learning that register as well as the more formal ones, and sometimes I'd mix them up and people would laugh at me, and it's quite funny.
That's the thing, though. I suppose when you're speaking in your first language, your own, or a language that, or languages that you're really proficient in, register comes quite naturally. But when you're learning a language, and you know, to all of us speaking here today, doing a runner, it's so obviously colloquial. But when you're learning vocabulary, you can't necessarily, because you're not at the level where you're thinking. That you're thinking in terms of the sort of beyond the words, beyond the vocabulary, in terms of meaning. It's not immediately obvious. So I can see how it would be easy to mix up a phrase, because you're still learning the sort of the essence of the language, the soul of it.
Exactly. It's like you're filling in a jigsaw puzzle. You're putting these words in registers on a daily basis, and that takes a long time.
Yeah. And language learners love to learn colloquialisms. I mean, because it integrates you into the language, and it just makes you feel that you're you're part of it more, doesn't it, when you're using these, idioms, idiomatic things and colloquialisms. But it's that whole thing about register, isn't it? Is that there's a time and a place for everything.
Exactly.
That can be the difficult one. Yeah.
And then other errors that are quite common are readability ones. So syntax errors, that's incredibly common. And issues with voice and style. And that's something that I would say the humanities and social sciences have in common with fiction, is a concern with voice and style, that they're really important for both of those fields.
So that's really interesting, Andy. They're quite sort of general issues, that sort of broad stroke things to look out for. But are there any specific challenges that working with translated literary or fictional texts that come along with it, that perhaps if you're an editor that doesn't generally work on these things, you wouldn't perhaps have at the front of your mind?
Yeah, so the kind of the developmental fiction literature on POV and issues like, for instance, head hopping, that's where you're writing in a third person limited or you kind of close up POV, not far away and omniscient, and you jump perspective from one viewpoint character to another without giving the reader much information. You could say they get whiplash from it. Anyway, head hopping is very much out of fashion in Anglo-American commercial publishing, but I've noticed that it's quite common in other, I have some clients from Germany and also from Croatia, and it seems that also when I read Croatian novels from time to time, and I do see it there more often. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not a fiction editor, and all I know about all that stuff is that head hopping is generally a no. But so that's interesting that you say that that's not the case in Croatian and German, or you're seeing it as being more acceptable there than in sort of Anglo-American.
And it might well be
literature.
because in those languages, the way those languages work syntactically, that it, for some reason, I mean, I don't speak them, but that they lend themselves more readily to that jumping of that close psychic distance in a way that we've come to expect not to see in Anglo-American publishing, commercial fiction anyway. And I am sort of now starting to wonder, if I spoke another language and I understood that language and I got that language, whether it would feel different somehow if I came across these multiple instances of that close psychic distance and that whiplash of bouncing from one head to another, whether it might somehow work. I mean, Andy, have you read Croatian novels where you've seen this happening, commercially published?
Yeah.
And so, how did it make you feel? Did it not bother you or were you kind of more, I don't know, tolerant of it?
Yeah, I've not read novels where it's been what I'd call a major problem. So I've seen novels where it's been at the minor to moderate sort of level of causing problems in the text. That's a really difficult question because I read a lot of those novels before I trained as a fiction editor, and and fiction editing is all about learning to notice particular kinds of things. So the novels that I've worked on over the past year, I've seen little bits of that, but nothing major. It's more that whenever I speak to authors about this, I've noticed there's usually a discussion about the rules being a bit stricter in the Anglo-American publishing. And that's not just about head hopping. I've noticed it with differences in first person POVs as well. So sometimes they'll mix a kind of an embedded one with a looking back, a retrospective one. All these kind of big structural issues. It feels like it can often be a bit more rough and ready in some of those other European literary traditions. Okay. So, and one more issue is that the whole convention around unusual dialogue tags being a no-no in Anglo-American commercial publishing. So they say stick to said, asked, replied for 95% of the time, and show it through dialogue instead of
no guffawed.
No guffawed and all of that.
Wheezed.
And I think that's actually, I have a theory about this. I think it's a bit of an arbitrary convention, and that it's quite handy for literary agents to have something where they can say, oh, we know who's workshopped their work and had other writers and people into fiction and fiction editing look at it. A kind of
a way of filtering things.
Yeah, exactly. This is my theory. I don't know if it's true. And I say it because I know that a lot of beginner authors do make this mistake, including people whose first language background is English.
Sure.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
This isn't something specific, but for translated stuff, it's much more okay to use different dialogue tags in, say, Croatian and in German.
Right.
Fiction, yeah.
And what about these things about body parts moving independently? Do they have that sort of thing as well? You know, like eyes rolling around the room and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's
is it still the same in translated materials. Yeah.
I don't know about that one because I've not sat down with an author and said, oh, in German, is this sentence okay? But I have brought it up once or twice when I've had a translated text. But then again, it comes up with first language English.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's one for me to investigate in the future.
Yeah.
Check that out.
It is interesting though, that isn't it, that in terms of the fashion of writing. So there's a kind of formula that works in Anglo-American publishing in terms of, say, thrillers, for example, where there are certain things that we know work and we know sell, and a lot of us reading them, and maybe people who are editors, those of us who are editors as well, have sort of taken time to think about why it works. And but certainly if you sort of go back 100 years or so, you see different fashions and different so now it's quite unusual in contemporary commercial fiction, like say a thriller or something, to see somebody using an omniscient viewpoint, whereas omniscient was really common in the Victorian age, and lots of people wrote like that, but then people weren't writing like Harlan Coben then, or you know, or Raymond Chandler or whatever. So it's like everything. It's like the clothes we wear and the our accents and our the actual words in our language. It just changes over time. And but it's quite interesting that it's very easy to sit within a bubble and think of the stuff that I think that's what fascinates me, is that I've definitely sit within a bubble of English language materials written on the whole by people whose first language is English, or who have English as one of a couple of first languages. And actually, when you start working on translated materials, you have got a much broader kind of sense of this glimpse into traditions and ways of doing things that perhaps are different, and it's good for editors to remember that publishing doesn't mean English language publishing, you know, that it's there's a whole world of creatives out there doing things.
I think it's so good for people to know that, you know, we tend to be so sort of Eurocentric, don't we, or certainly Western centric, and just to realize that there are different conventions out there and different approaches. That whole thing about the no conflict in Japanese writing as being a genre, I was never aware of that. You know, editors listening to this might think, oh, I want to go and learn about that. You know, I think it's really good for us to open our minds a little bit and learn from editors like yourself, Andy, who've got these skills and these experiences, and think about how we can apply listening to you to how we work with our clients, whether or not their English is their first language or their third language. It's been really, really good. And I think we could probably talk about this forever. But
that's what happens when Hodges comes on the podcast.
Exactly. The hodgepodge. So that's it. Thanks, Andy. That's been brilliant. And I think we can draw it to a close for this week. So thank you so much to our listeners. Yeah, thank you for coming on and talking to us. You're so welcome. We'll definitely have you back again. So Editing Podcast listeners, thank you so much for listening again. If you'd like to help support us, we've got a couple of options for you. And the first is that you can tip us a one-off donation of your choosing. And the link to that is in the show notes. Yeah. Louise, do you want to say something?
Sorry. I thought you were going to the link.
No, but you have to say not to say that, because it's absolutely ridiculously long and it sounds stupid. So.
And now I feel bad because I'm going to mention it's a shorter link.
It is a shorter one, yeah.
Anyway, listeners, you can join our Patreon community for only £3 a month at And here it is, the link, patreon.com/editing podcast, because I'm not scared of a URL. All our patrons get exclusive access to a huge batch of transcripts. You're not going to edit this out, are you?
No, I'm going to leave all this in just so people can see how cheeky you are to me sometimes. So anyway, both the links are in the show notes, and we'll put in a link to the thing that Andy mentioned about the Japanese genre thing.
Yep.
In the meantime, she's been Louise, the cheeky one.
She's been Denise, the lazy one. And he's been Andy, the marvellous one. Join us again soon.
Bye. Bye. Bye.